Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today we're going to look at this image of the Lobster Claw Nebula, and also includes the Bubble Nebula and some other stuff over here. This was actually captured for an hourly rental client, and he has given me permission to use his data along with some of my own data to do this recording. And in fact, that's not unusual that I'll use customer data always with their permission and record a video showing how I would process it. This is a little different in that this was just captured with SHO, no broadband RGB data. So it's all with all the data is SHO, and we're going to process this in PixInsight and Photoshop. Okay, so we'll get started in PixInsight, and I already have the data loaded into WBPP. These are the lights, and you can see there's sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen. No RGB, and then of course I've also loaded the master bias darks and flats. And the only other thing of interest on this, there's an output directory set, but if you go to the post calibration tab, and one of the things I did a little bit differently this time as an experiment was I enabled the drizzle, and I just left the scale at 1, so it didn't actually make the files any bigger in terms of doubling the resolution, for instance. But it does use the dithered data to, it does add, it looks like a little bit of extra detail. It does take longer to process, so that's the trade-off. And then once this is all set up, you just click Run, and I've actually already run this, so we'll look at the output. And I'll just double-click in the background here to bring up the File Open dialog, and go to the correct folder, go to the masters, and what I want is the sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen mono drizzle. And these actually open up with not only the image but also the mask data. So we don't need the mask data, so I'm just going to close that on each one of them. Now, since this is SHO data, we want something for the stars. And I have found, at least from my own experience, that HOO stars are more realistic looking than SHO stars. So even though we have SHO data here, and let's just quickly spread this out on the screen, and I'll just do a quick Control-A so we can do a screen stretch and see what the data looks like. What I want to do is create a new RGB file that has HOO data for the stars. So to do that, I'm going to open up the channel combination, and I want to drag the hydrogen into red and oxygen into green and blue. So here's the hydrogen. We'll just drag that tab up into the red, and here's the oxygen. So we'll do green and then drag it down again for blue. So now we have hydrogen, oxygen, oxygen. Click the solid circle, and that'll execute this and create the new RGB image. And click Control-A, that would be Command-A on a Mac. And there's a significant color cast. That's okay, that's going to get corrected as we process. I'm just going to update our tile so we can see all 4 of these on the screen at once. Excuse me. So generally the first thing I will do is run some sort of a gradient correction. I'm going to use Graxpert on this just because it's fast and easy. And I want to run that on all 4 images. So I'm going to create an image container. And I'll do that by right-clicking in the background, choose Image Container, and that brings up this dialog box, which I'll reset from the last time I used it. Click on the Add Views icon. There are the 4 views that are open, so I'll just select all, click OK, and now we have those 4 images added to an image container. And now to run Graxpert, I have a saved process icon over here. I can just drag this triangle from the image container onto the Graxpert icon, and it will go through and run Graxpert on all 4 of these images without any further input from me. And Graxpert also neutralizes the background of that color image, so we get a little bit better view of it. The next thing I want to do is run a Blur Exterminator in correct only mode, and I really only need to do that on the color HOO image because that's the one that I want to use the stars. And the stars look pretty good already, but if I run Blur Exterminator in correct only mode on that image, it will tighten up the stars and they'll look a little bit better. So after running Blur Exterminator, my next step is going to be to run spectrophotometric color calibration, and I want to run it in narrowband filter mode. So I'm just going to grab one of my, probably I'll use this the spectrophotometric mono. This has the filter wheel that I used for this image, and I want to just change it to narrowband mode. And then I can drag that triangle onto the image, and that's going to run this image through spectrophotometric color calibration in HOO mode. Okay, color calibration is done, so I can close this window, and we're moving right along here in PixInsight. The next step is I want to run Blur Exterminator in kind of the defaults mode on all 4 of these images. So I'm going to come back to my image container, which is still referencing the same images. We haven't created any new images, so we can just drag the triangle from the image container over to the Blur Exterminator process icon, and we'll let that run. And Blur Exterminator is done on each of these 4 images. So the next step is going to be to stretch each one, and then we'll run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator and save our 16-bit TIFF files. So to stretch each one, I'm going to just work through one by one, and I'll need to open the screen transfer function tool as well as the histogram transformation. And I'm going to do just the default. I'm not going to do anything kind of fancy or different on these. I'll just move this out of the way. So we'll start with the HOO image. I'm going to click on the radioactive button to update the stretch. So that's what the image is going to look like when it's stretched. And then I'll just drag these settings down to the histogram transformation, click the square to apply them, and then move on to the next image, update the screen transfer function, drag the triangle down, apply those, and that looks like it didn't work correctly, so I'm going to undo that. I don't know if I didn't get the settings copied correctly. Let's try again. There we go. That's what I would expect, is for the image to turn completely white. Go to the third one, update the settings, drag these settings down, and apply that. And usually if you're paying attention, you can see a little bit of change in the curve. So we'll move to the fourth one, radioactive button to make sure the stretch parameters are current. Drag the triangle down and apply this one. And we're done. So I can just press on select each one, press F12, and that will turn off the screen transfer function. I can also use the icon up here to turn it off. And the last thing we want to do now is run Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator on each one of these images. And again, I have a process container that does all of that. So I'll just drag the image container triangle over to that process container, and it's going to complete basically our last step in PixInsight. Once this is done, we can save these as 16-bit TIFFs and start in Photoshop. Okay, this is all done, and in fact we're done with the image container. Now that process created a set of stars for each one of the images. We really don't need the stars except for the HOO version, which is the one that's on top. I usually run a little enhanced stars process that reduces green and red using the SCNR process, and it also boosts saturation overall. With HOO stars tend to get a little bit overdone with that process, but we'll dial it back in Photoshop. So what I want to do is start saving these as 16-bit TIFF files. So we'll start with the stars and just go to File, Save As, and I need to navigate to the right folder, and I'm going to save these as a 16-bit TIFF, and I already had saved some earlier. I'm just going to overwrite the ones that are there if I need to. Overwrite it, yes, and we'll save this as a 16-bit TIFF. And I always just minimize rather than close these, because occasionally something gets messed up in saving. I save the wrong file or something. So it's good to be able to go back and recover something. And now I'll just work my way through these. This is the HOO version, and it will default to saving in that same folder that I just used, because this is a new image that hasn't been opened from somewhere else. Now the other three, because those were opened from the swap files folder, it will default to saving them to the same place where they were opened from. So we'll need to navigate to the correct folder. So again, Save As. This is the oxygen. So navigate to the folder we want to use and change the file type to TIFF. And again, this is going to be 16-bit. And I'll go through and save the last two, and then we'll go look in Photoshop. Okay, I'm done saving all the files in Photoshop, or for Photoshop. And one thing I'm going to do that I don't know if I've ever done this before, or certainly don't do it very often, I'm going to create an annotation image that we can overlay onto the image in Photoshop. So I can just pick any one of these images that has an astrometric solution and go to Script, Astrometry, Annotate Image, and I'll just use the defaults from the last time I ran this. And it's going to add the grid, constellation lines, named stars, Messier, NGC, PGC, and so forth. And you can also adjust the size and what of the text. And what I have shown or selected is Generate Transparent Overlay. So what it's going to do is create a transparent file that only has the annotations and the grid lines and so forth. And the rest of it is just going to be transparent. And then we'll save that also as a 16-bit TIFF file and open it along with all the others in Photoshop. Okay, there's our annotation image. So let's hop into Photoshop. And I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and that brings up this dialog where we can browse for the files that we want to open. And so we just need to navigate back to that same folder where we saved all of the files. And I want to put this in, I've got some extras here. I want to make sure I've got the right one. So I'm going to go to Details so I can make sure I'm getting the latest. And it is sorted in descending date sequence. So I'll just grab all of the files that we just saved, click OK, that adds them to the list, and then I'll click OK again, and that will actually open each one of these images as a separate layer. So we'll be ready to start working on it in Photoshop. And I'm going to use the action that I created a few videos ago to process the images for me kind of automatically. So to do that, the first thing I have to do is put the layers in the correct order, the order that this action or macro is expecting. And to do that, I need to, and I can just click and drag these layers to reorder them. I need the stars on top as the top layer, and then we need hydrogen next, then oxygen, then sulfur, and all these other layers that are at the bottom won't matter because it's only going to process the first 4 layers. And then I also need to make sure that the top stars layer is currently selected. And then I can go to my Actions palette and choose the Make Astro Layers. And this is in button mode. If I turn off button mode, then you see all of the kind of the gory details of the various actions. So it's usually a little bit easier to operate in button mode, and then I can just click on the appropriate button, and there it has grouped all of my layers, put them in the correct blending modes. This version even adds these text indicators, so I have an overall look at the file. Now, because it's sitting on these other layers, and these are all in some form of a see-through mode, we're actually seeing through to this bottom layer of this HOO data. If I turn that off, you can see that's what it looks like without that layer. And what I actually want to do is drop this into a layer group, change the name to HOO, and then we can turn off this entire layer group for now. This is the annotation layer. I'm going to drag it up to the top, even above the stars, put it in screen blending mode, and then we'll turn that off so it's not in the way. And I want to turn off these text references, so I can use these filters at the top of the layers palette, and they let you filter this list of layers for just certain types of layers. And the big T will filter and show us just the type layers. So if I click on that, there are the 3 type layers. I can just turn those off and then turn off the filter, and we're back to seeing the whole image, or all of the layers. And I want to turn off the stars and start working on overall color balance. And not surprisingly, most SHO images start out very green. So I want to do a couple things. First, I want to kind of normalize each one of the layers so they're all equally bright. And each one is using the full range of tones. And then from there, we'll work on kind of customizing the color. So the first thing I want to do is turn off everything except the sulfur layer, and we'll start with it. And I'll open up this layer group, and it's going to be much easier to see what we're doing if we turn off the hue saturation so that we can see it in just black and white mode. And I want to go to the levels adjustment layer, and I want to adjust the black point and the white point. And since this is sitting on a black background, which you can get to by right-clicking and choosing black as the canvas color, I want to darken the blacks in this layer so that they're almost black but not completely black. And if we look at the histogram, you can see that the data doesn't really start going from black to white. It starts somewhere around here, and then it ends somewhere around here. So we don't have anything brighter than this level, and we don't have anything darker than this level of gray. So I can compress this by me bringing the black slider over, and I want to bring it over to about where the background starts to turn black, but not quite black. I want it to be very dark, but not completely black. So that would be completely black, and you can see that it's blending into the black background. So that's too far. I want to be able to just kind of see the background all the way around. And then on the whites slider, we'll bring it over to just about where the data starts. And if you want to be really precise, you can hold down the alternate key, and then as you click and drag the slider, it will start to show clipping. And you generally, especially on the whites slider, you generally don't want any clipping. On the black slider, likewise, we don't want any clipping. So probably about there is as dark as we can go without clipping anything. Now I'll turn the color back on, collapse this layer, turn it off, and then we'll do the same thing with oxygen and hydrogen. So we'll turn off the color, go to the levels adjustment, adjust the black point so that we're just not getting any clipping, or at least very little. And then the white point, we're already way over to the edge, and that's probably this very bright nebula right here. and it could be some around the Bubble Nebula as well. So we'll just leave the white slider where it is for now. Turn the color back on, collapse the layer, turn it off, go to hydrogen, and we'll do the same thing. Start with the blacks. And again, the whites are already all the way over to the far right-hand side, so we'll leave that where it is. And now I can turn on SH and O. It's a little bit less green, a little bit more balanced. There are a couple things we can do to better balance the color here. To start with, we can kind of turn up the red. Red and green are more or less opposites. Actually, red and cyan are opposites. But if we add more red, that will take away some of that green. And sulfur is where the red is, since this is an SHO image. So if I go to the levels adjustment layer in the sulfur layer group, if I use the midpoint slider now to brighten the sulfur, what I'm doing is adding more red to the image. And it's not unusual when you do that some of that brightness bleeds over into the darks. So you typically, if you brighten the midpoint, you generally have to come back to the blacks and darken it back down a little bit. Still a lot of green, and that's coming from the hydrogen. So there's two ways we can approach this. One is we can turn down the brightness of the hydrogen, and we would do that by going to the hydrogen layer group, clicking on the levels adjustment layer inside that group, and if I move the midpoint slider, that will put less hydrogen detail into the image. The other thing we can do, I'll just reset this to 1, is change the color of the hydrogen. That right now we have hydrogen color mapped using this hue saturation color layer, and we have a color mapped to just a pure green, and that creates kind of an overwhelming amount of green in the image. And we can have an SHO image with this slider anywhere between red and blue. So if I want to take away some of the green, I could move it towards the cyan and blue and change the color to be a little bit more blue, or I could move it the other direction and make it more red. And it really becomes a matter of personal preference, which one you think looks better. In either case, it looks like we may want to darken the background. I kind of like moving it to the right so that it's more cyan and less green. And I find frequently when I move the, if I move the hydrogen left or right, typically I have to move the oxygen less but in the same direction in order to maintain a good balance. And we're getting a little bit of color bleed through here in what should be the background, and that's, I think, coming from both the oxygen and the sulfur because it looks a little bit magenta. So again, we'll go back to the levels and darken the black point a little bit. So that's one way of dealing with that background. The other approach would be to take our hydrogen more towards an orange, and it won't look right until we also adjust the oxygen. So again, we're going to move the oxygen hue the same direction we moved the hydrogen. And what we're really doing is creating, if you want to think about it this way, if I turn off the hydrogen, there's a sulfur, just sulfur and oxygen in an SOO image. And what I find is if I balance this one so that it looks pretty good as a starting point, and so I'm just turning up the red, and now we'll go to the oxygen, adjust the color of the oxygen, and then maybe add a little bit of brightness, a little more oxygen detail, and make sure we don't, so we have just the right amount in the background. Now when I add the hydrogen back in, it becomes a little bit more obvious what it's going to look like. And if we tone it down with the levels, So we're still getting a good SOO or SHO image. And that's probably a pretty good balance as a starting point. Generally, I would then turn on my global adjustments, and I might go to the hue saturation, and if you target the reds and go to the red hue, you can make the reds a little bit more red, and then maybe the yellows a little bit more towards the green to create a little bit more color contrast between the red and the green. The color of the oxygen, we could start by going to the oxygen hue saturation and fine tune it so that we get a nice pleasing blue tone. Yeah, maybe something like that. We've got a couple areas where we know the data is really bright. And if we look, for instance, here, this little nebula, which is, if I turn on the annotations, that's NGC 7538, and it's basically blown out in the SHO data. But if we look at the HOO, and what I'm going to do is hold the alternate key and click on this eyeball next to the HOO layer way down here in the bottom right, that will turn off everything else and turn on just this layer group. This is what it looks like in HOO. A little bit of data there. The bubble itself looks a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and turn everything back on just by alt-clicking again. And I'm going to turn on this HOO layer, and I'm going to drag it up above the hydrogen, but below my global adjustments. And I'm going to put this layer group in multiply blending mode. And that makes the bright part of the bubble and the bright part of this nebula look much better, but of course it makes everything else too dark. So we want to use a layer mask and reveal this layer group that's in multiply blending mode just in the very bright areas of these two regions. So to do that, I'm going to add a mask. I'll go to this circle inside a black square, click on that, and that adds a mask to the currently selected layer, which is the HOO layer group. I can tap Control-I to invert the mask from being white everywhere to black everywhere. So if it's black, that means it's hidden throughout. Now I can just grab my brush tool, and let's start at 10% opacity. We'll switch the color to white by using this little arrow back and forth to just switch back and forth between the foreground and background colors. I can use the left bracket key to make the brush smaller, and we'll just paint a little bit in here, and we'll do the same thing down here. That just brings a little bit more data back. This is still lacking a little bit of detail, and I believe if we look at the sulfur, let's look at just the sulfur, we do have data throughout in sulfur. So I'm going to make a copy of the sulfur layer, and I'm going to do that with Control-J. So now I have just made a copy of it, and I'm going to drag it up into this HOO layer. And I'm going to have to actually open the layer, drag it in, and let's put this in luminosity blending mode. So now we're bringing in the detail from the sulfur, the color from the HOO data, and we're multiplying that into the image in those two spots that are selected with the mask. If I turn this layer group off, you can see that's the impact of those two. Looks good here. It's probably a little too much down here around the bubble, so I'm going to come back up to my layer mask, switch from white to black, and I'm going to lower the opacity to 10%. And as I paint with black, that's reducing the amount of effect that this layer group is having on the image overall. So now we're using the sulfur, oxygen, and hydrogen in SHO color palette. We have global adjustments that we can play with if we want to play with the global brightness anywhere in the image. We have a global color balance if we want to fine-tune the color overall. If we want to play with the global saturation, we can do that in the global hue saturation. And then we have, as always, this almost black layer in light and blending mode, and that just neutralizes and cleans up any areas that have gotten darker and noisier. I might take the reds even a little bit more towards the magenta, make them a little bit more red. Something like that. Let's turn the stars on. The stars are a little garish and there's a lot of them, so let's finish up by working on the stars. First, I'm going to come to the hue saturation and turn down the hue saturation saturation overall. And then it's not unusual to have to target the reds and turn the reds saturation down quite a bit to get rid of that red noise look to the stars. And I'm going to knock out the little stars, and to do that we're going to use the dust and scratches filter, which looks for little tiny things and takes them out. So to do that, I'm going to convert this stars layer into a smart object so that everything is non-destructive. Now I can use the noise dust and scratches filter in non-destructive mode as a smart filter, and it looks like a radius of around 3 does a good job of knocking out all those little tiny stars that just look like noise. And then if we want to reduce it even a little further, we can move the stars layer black slider in a little bit, and you can adjust the stars brightness overall. And I find a lot of times I want to darken the whites in the stars so that they don't go pure white. If you look at this levels adjustment layer, the sliders you normally use are the ones right under the histogram, and that's the black point, midpoint, and white point. This lower set of sliders changes the brightest white or the blackest black. So if I move this white slider in, if you think about this gradient, what you're doing is, if I move it into this point, for instance, then that level of gray is the brightest white that we're going to have in the image. So if you watch the stars, you can see the cores of the stars are dimming just a little bit, and it keeps them from blowing out and becoming pure white. And by minimizing the stars, that lets us see through the stars and see to the nebula a little bit better. I may come back to the global adjustment, may brighten it a little bit, and then make sure the background's not getting too bright. And that's probably a pretty good place to stop. Hope you found this useful. And again, this is an SHO image with HOO stars, processed in PixInsight to get the basic data, and then we used Photoshop to color map and finish the image and do all of the selective edits that we wanted to do. If you have any questions, drop those in the comments down below. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.